Hello. Sorry to pull everybody away from a fast lunch and come here. And ignore me looking over here. I have to look at my notes sometimes. Um, this talk is obviously not about chess, so we'll start there. But I want you to bear with me for a minute because I may tell you some things that you know, and hopefully I put some context on some things that you know, but you haven't thought about the way I'm talking about them. And then we'll talk a little bit about the impact and change and the life we're about to live. So let me just move forward one slide and give a little introduction about myself. It's a great introduction. Let me just say, I'm not a researcher. I've never been a professor. I've actually never graduated from a school in my life. I'm somebody who found that technology could change the world and particularly change my life. And I became passionate about what it could do for other people's lives, which led me to go into the computer industry, work at a huge number of companies, Apple, Logitech, found a number of companies around mobile internet, social media, a company called Six Apart, and as you heard, was CEO of a company that became Amazon Alexa. And all of this is about bringing technology to people. But now, technology is coming to you with great force. This talk is based partly on these two books. If you haven't read these two books, do. I'm sure they're both available in Spanish and English, and they are both more important than anything I'll say here because they provide a depth I can't provide. But let me move forward for a second and give a little context to what I'm going to talk about and try to set your mind back a few hundred years. What I want to talk about is the industrial revolutions and what the industrial revolutions were and what they meant. Who knows what this is? Yes, that's a steam engine. It's one invention, right? It's just one invention. And what's this? Sorry? It is an assembly line. It's the Ford assembly line in that particular case, but it's an assembly line. One innovation. What did these things mean for the world? Well, they meant everything. In the end, we're talking about a change in the world that made it completely different how people lived. Production was moving from farms to factories. People were moving from cities, I gotta click both things. People were moving from the farms and the countryside to the cities. And suddenly, government changed. We moved from monarchies to democracies and other forms of individual rule. And transportation changed completely. People moving from horses and animal-driven transportation to cars. And not only did that change, but suddenly conflict changed. What used to be local conflicts, local fights between tribes became global conflicts on a massive scale, on an industrial scale. That happened over 200 years, and it seemed incredibly fast to people. Over 200 years, the world changed completely. Where people lived, how people ate, what they ate, how they worked, everything changed. But I'm obviously not talking about the Industrial Revolution now. I want to talk about something else. And first, I'm going to start talking about chess. I'm not really talking about chess, but I'm talking about a story that you may have heard and you may not have heard. It's an apocryphal story. It's not clear whether it's true or not. But the story is this: that the Sultan of India was an avid chess fan. Played it all the time, used it to go through conflicts without war, to simply say, okay, instead of a war, let's sit down and play chess. And he was so passionate about chess that he said to the inventor of chess, he said, I want to give you something for this invention. I want to reward you for this invention. And the inventor of chess said, I'm a modest man. I don't really need a reward. The people playing this game is my reward. I don't need anything else. He said, no, you have to tell me what you're going to do. Come back tomorrow and tell me what the reward is you want. And he comes back a day later, and he says something very disarming. He says, what I want you to do is I want you to take 1 grain of rice, and I want you to put it on the first square of the chessboard. And then I just want you to double it every time. Put a 2nd grain on the 2nd square. Put a 3rd grain on the 3rd square. And do like that, and that's all I want. And the Sultan says, well, that's ridiculous. That's not enough of a reward. You're just asking for rice. He says, Sultan, I'm a humble man. I don't need more than that. Just do that for me. I hope some of you know the punchline of this, but let me just walk through it for a second. The first half of the chessboard is very simple numbers. If you think about it, look, he's going to get 1 grain, then 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, right? We can all do this math pretty much in our heads. When you get to the 2nd quarter of the chessboard, the math starts getting bigger, but still it's not crazy big, right? 65,000, 131,000, 262,000. So you're multiplying up, but these are not crazy numbers. Even when you get here, up to 2 billion, this is not numbers that we can't deal with, that we don't understand. And so right now, maybe the Sultan was thinking, oh, this isn't a bad deal. We're talking about grains of rice, 1 billion grains of rice. What's that? But that's the first half of the chessboard. And it's not when things get crazy. Things get crazy on the second half of the chessboard. These are numbers that many of us can't even think about how to pronounce. Sure, I mean, when we get to trillion, okay, maybe, right? Or in this case, but what happens down here? Does anybody know how much rice he ended up asking for? Anybody have any idea how much rice he ended up asking for? Well, what he ended up asking for was a pile of rice bigger than the entire Himalayan mountain ranges. The power of exponential math is that we are talking about a number that most of us can't pronounce. I'll spell it out here, but I don't know that that helps either. 18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion. It is 1,000 times the 2019 production of rice. It is more rice than humans have grown in all of human history. So the theory about this story is, the punchline of the story is actually, when the Sultan realized what happened, he killed this guy. Because this was all the wealth that existed in the world and far, far more. And that's what he asked for. And clearly, I'm not here talking about rice, and my goal isn't to talk about rice. I'm here to talk about disruption and the impact of change. And I'm here to talk about one little invention. Think back to the Industrial Revolution, the one little invention of the steam engine. What's the one little invention I'm talking about? Anybody? The microcomputer or microprocessors. Gordon Moore in 1971 said that the power of computers was doubling every 2 years, and then he said every 18 months. But let's just call it 18 months for now. Okay? This is an amazing prediction. This is like a law of physics that we don't understand. In 1971, we had a doubling to 72. Today, this computer has a multiple, an exponential multiple of processors in it from back then. More processors than you could possibly get just 10 years ago. That law continues to hold true. People talk all the time about it not holding true. I will bet anything it will continue to hold true. As long as humans are around, as long as engineers have challenges, as long as people can make money doing this, predictions have often talked about when Moore's law will end. Today, there are predictions from CERN that say around the year 2600. Now, think about this for a second. We're talking about 1971 to 2022, 34 doublings of 18 months. 34. Back to the chessboard for a second. Things are pretty sane on the chessboard when we talk about numbers here. Things start getting insane. Some of you may remember things got a little insane in 2020. Things moved very fast. We're now here. 34 steps into the chessboard. Much of what's going on in the world today can be explained by this. If the power of a steam engine and 200 years of evolution that brought us gas engines and airplanes and all sorts of inventions changed the world completely in 200 years, what happens when we're moving this fast? What happens when you have this incredible exponential change happening suddenly? Moore's law doesn't just affect computers, obviously, is the same way the steam engine did not just affect steam-run machines. It affects everything. And the Industrial Revolution is moving at a much faster pace. This Industrial Revolution, the third machine age and the fourth machine age are moving at much, much faster paces than the first and second industrial age were. At the beginning of the chessboard, we got calculators, we got digital watches, we got a few trips to the moon. That's the first quarter of the chessboard. What do we get now? What is it that happens now? And what has changed in the world in just the first half of the chessboard? So if I ask you that question, think about what the world was like in 1971 and think about it today. There is almost nothing that we take for granted today that existed only those few years ago in 1971. I remember 1971 well. Everything has changed. Banking has changed. Media has changed. Communications have changed. The war has changed. Politics, medicine, dating, shopping, you name it. It will be hard for you to see something from 1971 that's completely untouched by this level of industrial revolution. In fact, it's easier to ask the question, what hasn't changed, than what has changed. Because it's much fewer things that haven't changed. One of the things that hasn't changed is humans, our mind, our ability to deal with change, and our understanding of change. We are not evolving, being forced by the digital age. The world around us is evolving, being forced by digital innovation. And I want to say again, this is just the beginning. If you think the world has been changing fast, buckle your seatbelts. This is the beginning of the second half of the chessboard. We are just here at the very edge of the crazy numbers, of the crazy multiplication. And we have to start imagining what that will mean for us. One thing to think about is, like I said, we haven't changed. We're still the same beings. So think about the fact that we adapt at a certain pace. The natural adoption pace for humans is generational. New humans are born, new humans can adjust to the new environment they're in. If things are changing at bigger than generational scales, there's room for adapting and changing. Things are not changing at that scale anymore. If we talk about human ability to adapt and the speed of technology, technology is clearly now moving much faster. We're not talking about 200 years to change all of society. We're talking about 20, and then 10, and maybe 5. And now we're moving from everybody here having a phone, 7 billion people out of 8 billion people in the world having access to the internet, right? 3 billion phones sold a year. But now we're moving from mass sales and mass adoption of these technologies and internet technologies to mass adoption of AI and robots and automation on multiple scale. And this is all closer than you think. There's a saying in technology world that says, and actually Hemingway coined this, but it means more for the technology world, I think, than what he was talking about. Things happen gradually, and then suddenly. And I've been in the technology industry since 1980, and I have seen this over and over. It's impossible. You can't do that. It's not going to happen. It happens. And more, this is the way the world works, and this is what we're about to see with the mass adoption of AI technologies that are moving faster than we are moving. And immediately we start seeing some effects of this, and some of them are disturbing. See political turmoil on a massive scale, the question of whether we can govern ourselves, whether we can solve our own problems, whether we are able to agree on things and move forward on those things. We see climate change, and climate change, don't fool yourself. If you couldn't have 8 billion people on the planet, if you couldn't have all these cars, if you couldn't have everything else, you would not have climate change. You have it partly because of our technological innovations that, of course, burnt oil and other things, but has led to the moment we're at today. And you have growing wealth equality around the world. The concentration of wealth is increasing, and it is increasing directly related to the control and access to these technologies and the ability to use them. And then, of course, we had COVID, which has a whole nother discontinuous impact. And I'd say to you, I believe the impact of that was the acceleration even more of the changes. More changes in terms of video conferencing, more in changing the workforce, more in using these digital tools. We use the digital tools to deal with COVID, but that accelerated the power of tech companies, that accelerated the use of technologies, that accelerated video conferencing, it accelerated everything. It didn't slow things down. It acted like a meteor hitting the planet and accelerating changes that were already happening. I don't want to pretend that most of what happened with our technological revolution is bad. Most of it is good. I don't know if everybody realizes, because we really don't talk about it much, but last decade, 1 billion people moved from starvation, subsistence, to having enough food to eat. In 1 decade, this happened. Nothing in human history has ever happened on that scale that fast. Life expectancy everywhere in the world, in the poorest parts of the world, in the richest parts of the world, is growing, right? I would not be alive on this stage 100 years ago. But it's not shocking for me to be here today. And I know you see the news, and I know social media makes it seem like the world is blowing up and things are on fire, but there has barely been a more peaceful time in human history than today. People, the percentage of the population that dies in battles, that dies of violent death in war or even crime, is a fraction of what it was during most of human history. These changes are all driven by our ability to control our environment, our ability to grow food, our ability to communicate around the world. And there's less starvation and better health care available for everybody. Even though it's horrible, I come from the United States, so we have a horrible, horrible healthcare system, but it's far better than anybody had 100 years ago. And believe it or not, more education and better education. And again, the number of people who were illiterate 50 years ago has gone down by 80% as a percentage of the population. But the question then becomes, can we deal with all this change? Are we even capable of adjusting to what is happening to us? If that adoption curve that I showed you before, the ability to adjust to change is real, are we capable of overcoming that, of learning about it? And I'd say in this sentence, the critical word is we. Everybody thinks and feels like these changes are happening to them. There's good reason to feel that. You don't feel in control of every change happening. You don't feel like you're forcing each thing to happen. You don't feel like you necessarily have a vote on each technology that comes out, on each change that happens. But the reality is we as a group do have a vote. And we as business people and innovators and academics and students and teachers and kids do have a vote and do have the ability to steer where the world is going. It's our need to focus on that that's critical. And remember, these digital tools that we have created, these engines of change that we have created, are in our hands now. It's our capability to use them to change the world. Suddenly, we have global crises. And suddenly, we have tools that allow for global communication. Right? Suddenly, we have climate change. And suddenly we have the processing power and the capabilities to understand both what's happening to the climate and to create innovations that will address those problems. But not if we are not able to govern ourselves and not if we're not able to work together. So the real question for everybody here is, do we have the will to do this? Are we willing to work together and take care of these problems? Because if we're not, I can promise the speed of change is not going to slow down. I can promise you the technological innovation is going to continue, and the world will change faster and faster. And we have to dedicate ourselves to, let's say, grabbing the back of the dragon and riding that forward. So the final question becomes, how much pain is this going to take? I've spent the last few years trying to find a situation in history where human beings have pulled themselves back from the precipice of disaster, whether it was totalitarian governments like in Nazi Germany, whether it was disastrous destruction of the environment, as happened other times in human history. A great example is fertilizer from guano. I don't know if you know this, there were wars fought over bat shit pretty much around here, and those wars ended up doing one thing. We used up all the guano in the world, and the world looked like it was going to face starvation. Fertilizer from guano is what got us to the point of having 1 billion people on the planet. Human ingenuity is what got us to the point of being able to support 8 billion. Because when we're running out of guano, a few scientists said, wait a second, what we've got there is nitrogen. That's what we're looking for, is nitrogen. Does everybody know that 80% of everything we breathe is nitrogen? That the atmosphere of the Earth is not oxygen, it's nitrogen. Oxygen is a small portion of the atmosphere of the Earth. And scientists got together and said, well, if we could get this nitrogen out of the air, we could solve this problem. We won't starve to death. And so a few scientists got together and in a period of 20 years learned how to fix nitrogen from the air and change the world completely. Avoided starvation and allowed for agricultural output to increase by 10x. The problems we're facing today are worse in some ways, but they still require the same thing, which is a dedication to focusing on solutions, not the problems, not the hopelessness, but the solutions to them, and believing in the ingenuity of humans to solve them. So it's up to you, and I'm a little early, which I rarely end up doing, so I will take some questions if you have them. And if not, thank you.
We got any questions? Question, please raise your hand or stand up so we can see you and get you the microphone.
It's okay.
Oh, that's good. Oh, wait. One.
Okay. The shy happens.
Barack, I was listening to your panel yesterday on thinking a bit outside of the box. And I think there was some great messages that you and your panelists gave us about how rules have to be thought of after they're starting to be applied. I think if you've got a few minutes and thoughts about we're thinking about how exponentially we can grow, but there's also exponential limitations, regulations, rules, education. So if you could give us a few minutes of your thoughts in the minutes that you have on those topics.
I'm not I'm not sure that I have very meaningful thoughts about it, except to say that one of the things that has to happen with innovation is innovation needs to be allowed to happen. And because you can't predict what that innovation will be, you cannot predict what regulations or what approaches you can use in advance to control those innovations. So the example I used yesterday was an example. You've got volcanoes here. I've spent a lot of time living in Japan. And in Japan, many of the volcanoes have concrete barriers to steer the lava flows. I don't know if you have that here, but they basically, Sakushima in southern Japan has population living right below the volcano, right at the base of the volcano. And they realize you can't stop a volcano. You can't put a cork in the top of the volcano. Lava will flow, but you can steer where the lava will flow. That's a physics problem. And so I think we have to think about innovation the same way. Innovation is unstoppable. You can't put a cork in it. It will happen somewhere. Invention is unstoppable. If it can be invented, it will be invented. What you need to do is figure out how you have it flow so it does the least harm and the most good, and how you think about the world as how you can steer things, not control them. So that's my only thought about it. Okay, thank you.